To significantly increase your chances of finding gold, the best place to go is where gold's been found before. Sounds obvious, sounds stupid, but go where the old workings are, especially if you're a beginner. You're out in the bush, you come across some old workings. What you need to do and get your eye tuned in so that you can scan across the old workings and see what is happening and why they did things. And from that, you can interpret where the gold rich zones are, where they may have left gold behind or gold was breaking off and falling away from before the old timers even got there. So the best way to get your eye trained in and to understand why things are working is to get to grips with some of the mining terminology used in the old mines and why they did it. So I'll start this video first up, covering some of the common mining terminology, how they sunk a shaft, how they dug the ore out, how how they transported it away from the mine. And in the process, I'll be pointing out the vectors that'll be telling you, look here, look here, look here, and those are the places to go and take your metal detector. So come along for the ride. I'm sure you'll find something of value. So I'll jump straight in. I'm using the whiteboard, so hopefully you can see what I've got here. So off we'll go. So the most common ones you're going to see things is called shafts, open cuts, open stopes, adits, costines, those sort of terminology, but we'll cover them as we go. So let's say we've got a slight sloping hill. Now this is a cross section through the hill, and we might have a tree on top. Okay, so the prospectors have loamed this. I'll put up links to a good example, a good video that I found on the web that talks about loaming. It's a really good example. So they've loamed it. They've found where the quartz vein is potentially outcropping or near to the surface. It doesn't have to outcrop. And this is where the gold is shedding from. So they've detected that there is a structure bearing down like this into the ground. So there's two ways they can do it. So let's change this to red so we can see the difference of the quartz going through the system versus my blue lines. Okay, so they would either sink a shaft here vertically initially on the hole to see what it is, and then it's more likely on the smaller scale operators that they would incline the shaft to run down parallel to the structure, and so they're mining as they're going. But this only takes you so far, and very quickly they will stop mining like this. What generally happens once they've got an idea that this is actually paying and maybe paying quite well, they will then sink a shaft down dip from the structure and sink a shaft down to near to the lode. And what they will then do is put what's called a horizontal drive. Now you'll see in some publications and in some parts of Australia and the rest of the world, they may call this a drift. Some people call them tunnels, but most of the time over here in West Australia we call them a drive. And they will drive across horizontally looking for the lode. Once they've intersected it, they'll then start basically to mine it. And so this is where the advantage of coming in from underneath pays dividends to them, because they can use gravity to help them mine it. So they will start to basically tunnel their way up along the lode heading towards the surface. So when they put a charge into the face and blow it up, or they're basically just hacking it out old style with hammer and picks, the gravity is pulling the rocks down the slope and piling it up at the bottom. Just going to break the flow of the presentation here, guys, and apologies for breaking it. I just wanted to ask, are you guys getting any value out of my discussions and talks about different topics? especially the one today. If you have, I'd love a like. If you haven't subscribed, please join the club. And if you do getting any value at all, I'd love it if you could buy me a coffee. The link's down below. If you don't want to, that's fine. I'm not a hater. Everyone should enjoy. But it does give me the motivation. It just gives me the feeling that someone's getting a value out of it, and it makes me try harder to make better videos in future. So thank you very much. Here's a shout out for the names of the people that have already given me a coffee, bought me a coffee. Much appreciated, guys. And back to the presentation. That rocks is then taken to the surface in a generally called a kibble, which is just most times it looks like an overgrown iron bucket with a big handle on it, and that bucket sits in here. Of course, nothing really to scale on this drawing, and that is drawn to the surface with some sort of winch. Now, most of the guys who did the mining in Western Australia in the small scale prospectors in the latter part of the 19th century and into the early parts of the 20th century would have set up what is called a windlass at the top of the shaft. Most of this consisted of nothing but a relatively large branch, somewhat round in shape, somewhat regular in length, and the rope is around it, and a big crank handle, and one or two guys would crank the handle, and the bucket would be lowered down the shaft, carrying both the men going down the hole, as well as taking equipment and bringing the rocks back to the surface. This rock would be brought to the surface and thrown usually into one of multiple directions, but a predetermined direction in which to throw it. On one side of the hole, now this is really key for metal detectors to understand this. On one side of the hole, they would have pulled mullock out of the hole. Mullock is basically all the waste rock. And so it's anything that took to dig out the shaft, to cut the drive, pick up any bits that have fallen off the backs, basically the roof of the drives, cleaning up the tunnel. They've got to get rid of this stuff. And so they'll bring it to the surface and throw it to one side, usually onto what's called a mullock dump. And this could be a large pile of dirt of varying rock types because it basically doesn't carry grade. And they've thrown it onto one side. You can find these quite common around old workings. Yeah, they're worth looking at because they're seeing what the people drove through. It's also worthwhile checking out some of the quartz because they may have driven through some small stringers that are carrying gold, but you generally wouldn't want to spend an awful lot of your time on those. The other part of the thing is when they get into these veins, into the nice bit of the lode, they pull this up and basically they're then going to stockpile it somewhere. And so they will have basically an ore stockpile. Let's draw this one in. Oh, I've lost my red pen. They'll draw this one as an ore stockpile. This is what you want to find, because that is the one that's most likely going to carry detectable chunks of gold in it. Now, on these old workings themselves, and I'm talking the surface here, if you walk around the old workings, and please guys, please be safe around old workings. The sides can be very crumbly and sliding in. Many of the collars of these holes, the collar is the top part of the hole where it comes to the surface, can be quite collapsed in. So this is no longer a vertical shaft at the surface, and it looks like a big cone heading into a shaft area. If you fall into that, many of these sloping areas are too steep to get out, or they're so full of scree, basically broken up bits of rock, loose stuff, that you can't climb your way out. And you will going to have assistance to get your way out again. So please, please, please be very careful about walking around the edges of old workings. Also be very careful about, as you come across and there's a slight depression in the ground and a big unrepresentative pile of mullock nearby and a slight depression. Now, one of the conditions that on some of these mine sites that existed years ago, and it was they were basically instructed by the various mines department people to rehabilitate the mine site before they left. So they can't take all the dirt. Well, they didn't want to. They could have. They didn't want to take all the dirt and throw it back down the hole again. Okay, so they did the absolute least possible work they could do. So most of them would throw a bunch of branches down the shaft. So these branches jammed up in the shaft. Then they would throw in a couple of sheets of corrugated iron. So this may be down 2-3 meters below the surface. And then they would fill it up with dirt. So when the inspector came to visit, all he can find is no shaft and a bunch of area that looks like it's been cleaned up, and they got the tick. That would have been good enough for 20, 30, 40 years. But unfortunately what happens is these branches rot away, they dry out, the corrugated iron rusts, and the whole surface starts to sag in. If you walk over that surface and it just happens to be not your day, you could break through those corrugated iron sheets or sticks and fall into this basically Viet Cong style trap of things that are going to stab and jab into you, and you could be stuck there for a very long time. So please guys, be very careful when walking around old workings. But back to my nomenclature system. Let's clean up the system, bring it back to how I had it. So we've got a vertical shaft, and they started to work their way up. Now if we're looking onto, so this is a cross section through it. So if we're looking from this direction onto the mine, here's the top of the hill, here's the shaft gone down, and they've tunneled this way across, and they've found the quartz vein which is running this way, and they're starting to dig out a chunk of the quartz. Now this bit here represents this bit here. Hopefully you can understand my change in perspective here. This is generally called a stope. And a stope is basically an area they take out as much as they can of the gold and leaving as little of the country rock behind. There's no point in taking a 2 meters slab of rock at the ground when your quartz vein is only 5 to 10 centimeters thick. So many of these things are very tight. Guys would have to get in there and wiggle on their sides using only a candle to navigate their way through here and hack away at the quartz hours on end and work their way back down to load it up. Very, very hard work. So that is what a stope is. An open stope is when one of these things makes their way to the surface. Either someone dug the surface out, or the quartz paid until it ran all the way to the surface and they took it all out. So you see that, then you know that was actually quite profitable and well worth investigating further. But back to our cross section. So they've now tunneled their way up, taken as much as practical. To stop the rocks falling in, they would have used wooden supports running across from one side to the next to hold up the rocks, and so it allowed people to work their way up and down. But they need to access the bit below now. So they would continue the shaft on and drive out the next way and continue the process again. So this is where they started to have to come up with terminology to describe which drive was they working on. And so mines developed this terminology of levels. So this might be, this very early mines would have a concept of this is level 1, this is level 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on like that. But that didn't really help too much. So they then changed the nomenclature to basically represent the depth below the surface. So if this was back in the 1890s, early part of the 2000s, Australia was still in the imperial system. So everything would have been done in feet. So you may have found that this was the 100 level, and this one was the 200 level. Basically meaning that was 100 meters below the surface, 200 meters below the surface, and so they went on. And so you can judge, if someone said they were working at the 700 level, that meant approximately 700 feet below the surface. You can do the maths and work out roughly how many meters it was. So that covers most of those terminologies. You've got things like rises, which are a vertical, for want of a bird, a tunneling attempt. There may be another drive coming out here where they tunnel their way up and connect from one drive to the other. And that's classified as a rise. Done for all sorts of reasons, anything from getting equipment through to testing the rock in between or to aid in ventilation. So ventilation was, in many ways, is a killer for many of these guys. Because as you get down here, there's not a lot of fresh air circulating around. So they had to come up with ways to get air to move. Some of the other mines would actually have multiple shafts where they would actually sometimes, and some people don't really believe this too much, they would actually have a fire at the bottom of the shaft. So you'd have another shaft out here. They would build a fire at the bottom of this shaft. That would drive hot air up the system. That would suck cold air, cooler air, fresher air down this shaft and ventilate the mines. That required a lot of work. A lot of people to go and collect the timber, to maintain the fires, to look after the system. So it had to be a big mine that was well worth the production. So how does this help you when you're out there looking for places to prospect? Look where the shafts are. Look where the open stopes are. Look for the distribution of the mullock dumps. Look how big the mullock dumps are. If they are small, then you can realize this most probably didn't have a very long mine life. That could be a whole bunch of reasons. Sometimes when these guys were digging these shafts, what they would do is they would actually run into the water table and the mine would start to flood. Now, unless you had steam engines in those days to pump it dry, that was pretty much the end of the mine. And many a profitable mine in Western Australia was basically stymied by water. And so don't disregard it, just find out where the water is. You can sometimes determine that by standing near the shaft and throwing a decent sized rock into the shaft. If you can hear water at the bottom of the shaft, that's a good sign. If it just crashes onto the ground, you can guess they didn't run into water problems. So look for the open stopes, look for the shafts, look for the mullock dumps. Then also start to look at how do you find out where look for this ore pad. Now, I would imagine in many cases this is the hardest thing to find, because you're not the first person to ever go to some of these mine sites, and so most of the easy picking stuff has been worked over. But on these, and I'll clean this map off here, and so this cross section, and draw a simple map of a mine site, and this could help you find some possible targets. Apologies, my cloth's a bit clogging up. Okay, so we've got a shaft here. We've got a big mullock dump sitting next door. And then you may find there's a set of stone walls that run out something like this. They may only be small, less than a meter high, sometimes more. Quite well made stone walls that end with a very flat end. Sometimes with timber, sometimes with big blocks of rocks. And this is quite flat. The idea behind this being, this is where they would reverse the horse and dray up. Now, those who don't know, dray is a little flatback cart that's pulled by one or more horses. They reverse the dray up to the back of the loading dock, for want of a better word, because that's exactly what it is. Any ore that had been piled up on here would have been loaded onto the dray and taken down a horse track to somewhere where they were processing the ore. Most of the time it wasn't done right next to the mine site, it was done away from the site. So areas to prospect, obviously all around here, because stuff fell off this ore pile when they were loading and fell into the ground down here and most probably got buried. So there's a high chances of finding something in there. But be warned, there's going to be an incredible amount of junk. Nails, pieces of tin, wire, you name it. Anything that can set your metal detector off is going to be in there. But remember, dig through the junk and you'll find the good stuff. Sometimes also along this path, because as the horse and cart was going along, bouncing along through this sort of like WA bush, bits of rock are falling off the cart and they're sitting along the side of the road. So go for a bit of a wander, take your metal detector, go along the side of the road. You may find a chunk of quartz with some nice bit of gold in it. It just fell off the cart, especially if it was a rich deposit. So check that out. See if you can follow it around. You may be lucky and you may come across the bit of the area where they processed it. Either they crushed it down smaller bits for further processing, or it was taken away to a state battery for processing. So those are the areas. Target around the loading bit. Have a good squiz at what's happening on the mullock dump to see what type of rocks are going through. See if you can find any open stopes that are coming to the surface. Look at the ground, the direction of the slope of the ground. If it's dipping away this way, this is where your likely zones of gold nuggets are going to be. Again, a lot of old rubbish in the ground as well, but well worth taking the detector and checking over the top. So hopefully those tips helped you. If there's any terms that you think I might have forgotten, please drop them in the comments below, and I'm more than happy to answer every question that comes along. And happy prospecting, guys.